IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Do you remember just a few months ago, there was a lot of talk about how it costs OpenAI millions of dollars to build and train the AI models like ChatGPT and hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep it running every day. Now, these costs of training and running large language models were prohibitively expensive and only a few big tech companies could afford it. Only a few companies could afford to do research on these things, to study it and to test it out and build different applications around it. Now, that understanding has been turned upside down since the time Meta launched open sourced their LLM named LLaMA. Now, what happened and what are the implications of this move? To talk about this, I have with me my colleague Satya. Let's get started. So first, let's understand the timeline and what happened and why did Meta open source the LLMs. So Satya, can you just talk about how this happened?
Yeah, Bharath. So to give a very rough time frame here and a rough sense of developments, in mid-February, Meta announced its AI language model. So it wasn't accessible to the public like OpenAI's ChatGPT or Bing, which used a version of ChatGPT, or even Bard from Google. It was given out in a case-to-case basis for research use. So it wasn't a public chatbot, but it was licensed under an open source package so that anyone in the AI research community can request access to. So the idea was to democratize access, but still the guardrails around AI development, large language model, data sets and training, etc., were the reasons why Meta did not make it accessible to every single person or upload it online. Except in around a week after Meta started taking requests for access, LLaMA's model was leaked online, I think on March 3rd or so. So a downloadable torrent was posted on 4chan, which is, as everyone knows, is usually where things like this start. And the problem was, the moment something got on the internet, it's very difficult to take it down. So even though Meta started issuing copyright infringement requests and takedown requests, it's still out there. And since then, Meta has been putting out statements to talk about why they think this is going to empower a lot of research use and everything. They haven't exactly talked about the dangers of democratizing open source LLM, so to speak.
So, right, like you mentioned, this was released under a non-commercial license and it got leaked. I think someone posted on the GitHub link that Meta was maintaining that there was a pull request which posted a link to the torrent as well. So now when we talk about Meta open sourcing the AI model, now they've invested so much money into building it and training it, and that's usually thought to be in the order of tens of millions, or if not more than that. So now why would someone who's invested this much make it open source and give it all out to the public? So when you think about what were the motivations to do that, so you can look at probably at the time that they did it, OpenAI and Google were dominating the LLM development. The ChatGPT was all the rage, and then Google had Bard coming out. And Meta's model was significantly smaller than what was out there. And open sourcing it at that time leads to a wide adoption by a lot of different people for whom the costs were a barrier. Now, when you're talking about tens of millions of dollars in training, not everyone, even universities, would be able to afford to invest so much and build something like that, right? So open sourcing it makes it very accessible to a lot of people. And when a lot of people start using this, there's a lot of innovation that comes out of this. So you see that there are different applications that come out. There's people integrate it into other applications and are able to use it in different ways. For example, what you saw with Stable Diffusion. Earlier, you had Dolly, which was AI-powered text-to-image generation tool. And there was another open-source tool called Stable Diffusion. It advanced very quickly, and it was integrated into a lot of other products, which made its use cases much more stronger. And it's a very stable kind of a platform now. A lot of companies do this so that they're able to get bigger community involved, get a lot of innovation coming in. But at the same time, what is open sourced is usually the non-differentiating base model, but they usually retain the advanced differentiating features as proprietary features. Now, so you still have something that's exclusive, something that is not accessible to the public, that they have for themselves. But a base level of a base platform is made open source, so you get a lot of people onto that platform, make that the de facto thing, right? So
on that point, Bharath, actually, listeners, the easiest example you can see is GPS. So US DARPA developed GPS, and when they did make it available for civilian use or for integration for other countries, even potentially rivals, they did retain the more capable capabilities. So the location accuracy, etc., stuff like that, for still defense and government use for them, and so civilians could use a not as accurate version for their use cases. So that means that innovations that use GPS, etc., could be taken up by the US government and used while they still retain their advantage.
Right, and you see that even with Android or other tools, which a lot of the big tech companies open source it, so they get a lot of people to adopt it. There are bigger network effects that come into play. Then that becomes the de facto standard. But then, even as you see with Android, Google controls the Play Store and other features that are proprietary to Google. But you have the base version of Android that is open source, and a lot of folks on that have created different variants of the operating system. So this another benefit of this is that it increases the hireable talent pool for these companies as well. So you have a lot of people, a lot of researchers, hackers working on these things. So you get new products and all of that, but you also get, if you're looking for talent in this space, you will have a lot of people who are using it, who know how to navigate the code or the platform, and it's easier to find people when you need them, right? So that's another advantage of why a company would open source that. Now, this is what has happened. Now, there are some advantages like meta claims, right? So they say that, like you were saying, Satya, like it democratizes the access to the to the LLM itself. So what are the other advantages that are generally talked about in this space?
I mean, it's usually an extension of that argument itself. The fact that lowering entry barriers for someone with a single MacBook and some abundance of free time, for them to be able to take a large language model and fine tune it for their particular use case. For instance, think about a research department at a university which doesn't have like in India, for instance, that doesn't have the funds to access supercomputer time and work on for whatever project they have. They can just pull together their own laptops, get a version of LLaMA, and fine-tune that with their own data sets, or introduce something like reinforced learning from human feedback system for that, and very specifically use it for that project. And it would A, allow them to even work on the project, and B, cut down their timeline by I don't know, significant amount of time. Right. So, and I mean, technically speaking, there's also a winner in the sense that Meta is winning from all this, because whatever developments come out into the public domain, because they're under that non-commercial use license, they can still adapt the technology behind it or the improvements created by the users there. So yeah, so that's pretty much it.
Right. So like you mentioned, there have been improvements, like people have taken the base model and then they have trained it on different data sets. They have introduced new features, like one is maybe reinforcement through human feedback, or even multimodal inputs. And there are other additions which enable this to be run on something like a MacBook, or even a phone for that matter. So all of these are possible, and we will see a lot of other interesting use cases come about because it is open source and it allows all of these to be.
Another thing, by the way, so I just forgot. I mean, ChatGPT is trained on 175 billion parameters, and LLaMA, it seems, is 33 billion or something like that. But imagine if all the weights and other parameters by an entire planet's worth of people is also accessible to Meta or in the public domain. I mean, that the scale of that is also, unimaginable. I would say that's also another, win for Meta, I guess, but also generally for the public domain.
Right. So these are all the advantages that you can think about. But there's also a lot of concern. A lot of people are pointing out that when it is open source, it is accessible, yes, but it is accessible to everyone, irrespective of what their intentions might be. And we'll take a short break and we'll come back and look at what some of those concerns are and whether there's any weight to those concerns and how those could be addressed. So welcome back. So we were talking about how there are a lot of advantages that come with open sourcing the LLMs, and now we look at some of the pitfalls that are being talked about as well. So there's a lot of talk about why this is dangerous, and it's going to amplify a lot of misinformation and online harms and things like that. So what you see generally is that a lot of these the ethics debates focus on super intelligent AI going rogue and not being under the control of humans. But what is more likely in the near term is that when something like this is open sourced, malicious actors might get access to this AI and they might be able to scale up their misinformation campaigns or hate speech, deep fakes, and all sorts of things, right? So how credible is this kind of argument? Are we really going to see something like that happen? Satya, anything you'd like to say on this?
Yeah, so the ethical and social implications of the usage of open source LLMs, it's the same as something like someone entering a prompt on ChatGPT and creating a very nuanced and believable sounding phishing email that they can send across to, fish people. I would say, these are continuing problems. It's always going to be in a debate. More than that, I think the primary issue is the reason why the debate on ethics is happening is because, things like training data sets are meant to be unbiased, are meant to be compliant with privacy and consent concerns from the data sources. Now, the reason why these guardrails are there because these large language models need to ensure that this training data set is of high quality, right? They have to be representative of the population that it is serving generally as a societal concern, right? So this is not going to be possible when you have open source LLM models which can be stored locally and trained locally on a laptop. Now, there's also anytime model is updated or iterated, there's always also a clear documentation. People on GitHub and software engineers will know this documentation is evaluation and feedback mechanisms for these models. They can document why, maybe this is generating misleading outputs, etc. So be careful about it. That's also not going to happen. If a LLM model is out there and let's say someone is uploading it as a zip file on Telegram saying, hey, this is a great model, you guys should use it. And I don't know, college students are going to use it a lot for whatever reason. And they're going to basically propagate, like I said, misinformation or misleading outputs or even things that are going to maybe shape their worldview, right? So, cyber attacks are also very, very self-explanatory. Not any AI can brute force cyber attacks, pretty easily. I'm not familiar with the technical aspects of it, so I'm not going to speak much on it. Finally, I think no one can buy a GPU for cheap these days. NVIDIA GPUs cost a lot. So if, for instance, local stakeholders like a university or something wants to train data sets, etc., they can outsource this task to maybe a particular provider who has, let's say, 100 GPUs or something, and then they'll just run these GPUs nonstop. So what I'm saying is, if it becomes the next crypto kind of thing, where we saw for, I think, 3 or 4 years that GPUs are flying off the shelves, and these guys were using it all the time, where power draw and environmental emissions were significant enough to make it a concern. I can see something like this happening, right? So yeah, this is again a very rough idea. There are probably more pitfalls that I'm not sure about.
Right. So when you're talking about the misinformation getting amplified and all of that, so there are ways that people point out that this could be addressed. So these models that are open sourced are still not the ones that are cutting edge or the best that is out there. There are better and more powerful models. So if there is misinformation or disinformation on, say, the communication platforms that we use, there could be better AI models that could detect it and moderate such harms. So that is one kind of a way to address this kind of a concern. And there's
No, like I said, it's going to be a never-ending debate because it's not a problem of AI or large language model itself. It's a problem of scalable technology that augments human capabilities, right? So, I mean, if humans lie, anything they're going to enable them to lie is going to be a problem at scale. Like, so internet, for instance, so emails, like, I mean, we can't stop developing them because of this.
Right. And another aspect of this is that Seth Lazar, who's a leading AI researcher, he points out that the limiting factor in spreading disinformation is not the cost of producing the content, but actually convincing people and going forward with that, right? So the number of people who will actually believe it, and that is more of a limiting factor. So the existing solutions for limiting disinformation should work for AI content as well, is what he opines. So
I suppose. Go ahead.
So it should not be so much of a problem. So that's one point of view on this. That while it gives the ability to scale disinformation, it is still possible to limit it using the tools which are already out there, or using already things. The effects of it will not be so bad. Is one point of view, which is, the jury is still out there because this is still a new thing, and we have not seen the effects of it playing out for a long time. So we'll need to wait and watch what happens. But these are the two different points of view on what could be the possible outcomes of open source model and how they allow people to, malicious actors to spread disinformation. So yeah, you were saying, Satya?
All I can think about in the near term is, two things. Like, if you're going to open source a model, make sure that it's, probably connected to the internet to be able to be operational, so that it has a built-in verification mechanism that checks the reliability of the sources in the data set, or consistency of the data that's contained therein. I don't know how it might work, but that may be a technical guardrail that any corporation that's trying to open source their LLM can include it. The other thing is, the state needs to have civic engagement or AI literacy programs to be able to raise awareness and resilience of the public against this misinformation. Because, I don't know. We already have seen WhatsApp forwards creating a lot of issues, because just the scale of it means that instead of reaching 100 people, it's going to reach 100,000 people. And even if just 5% of them believe in it and act on it, create a lynch mob or something, that is still a sizable number of people. So I don't know what form this kind of civic engagement should or might take. But yeah, so that's... So like you said, it's just existing tools that we can use, nothing else.
Right. Given that you have some idea about IP laws and all of that, so does this open sourcing of these models, does it have any implications on any litigation or something that could come about as a result of this? What are your thoughts there?
So we have already seen how Stable Diffusion and DALL-E 2 have been employed in intellectual property, copyright infringement, for instance, disputes in the US, where the training data sets includes artwork, music, other literary works, etc., from creators who haven't been compensated for it, right? So that is the most basic way in which IP litigation can probably happen, because if anyone is training large language models, even on a non-commercial license, but it's difficult to attribute, right? So even if you use a training data sets from, say, a repository of art by an artist, but you may not know because you have gotten that data set on, like I said, GitHub or a Telegram group, and you just thought it was neat, and you didn't know who the author was or whatever, and you didn't care because you're tuning your large language model. The prospect of that is exciting. But if you don't have attribution, for instance, that is going to be a problem. If that person hasn't consented to that material being used for a training data set, that is going to be a problem. Right. So the ownership and licensing of the training data is the first order issue that I can think about. Right. So Reddit and Wikipedia are like different terms of user licenses. That is primarily what LLaMA was trained on, if I believe. Then the second part is the ownership and licensing of the outputs from these models. So because they're derived or influenced by the training data, the question about the ownership and licensing of the outputs and whether they infringe the intellectual property rights of the data sources or even the model developers, let's say, or if for instance these models can generate outputs that are similar or identical to existing works, right? So like someone might say, hey, this is passing off and not passing off. So that's a trademark thing. So the potential for this kind of issues to be brought to judicial fora is pretty high. And this is also what we're seeing with Stable Diffusion DALL-E 2, which is the output, the ownership and licensing of the outputs. Then finally, liability and accountability of the developers of the large language model and the users. Right. So if misinformation, defamation, or cyber attacks happen because like leveraged by using a particular open source LLM to third parties, then questions about this liability is going to come up. Are they responsible for the consequences of their actions, or neglecting to like maybe have some sort of duty towards the public in general for not letting the LLM be used for malicious purposes? We don't know that yet. We don't know where the buck stops. We don't know the civil and criminal liability in any of these cases. So I can imagine this is going to crop up in the near future.
Right. So there's a lot of debate about AI regulation, across the world, right? So we will see a lot of these debates playing out, and you'll see a lot of. It'll be interesting to see how that goes. So we've seen a lot of different implications of this open sourcing of this model. So to conclude, for India, is there any specific advantage of this being available? One of the things that you can think of is that these costs were prohibitively expensive, that there was a very big barrier for someone to implement these foundational models or to do research about them, or to understand how they work and so on, right? So now that barrier has been kind of removed, and people have access to these things, right? So that that knowledge and that those frameworks are now available, which could lead to a lot of things being built using these models. So that is one advantage that I would think would come. And this is not just for India, but globally. But for people where these barriers were significant, this will be a very big advantage. Other than that, do you think that there's anything else that might, for us, any advantage that you see playing out?
I do believe someone talk about disadvantages, especially in India, or like I say, I believe any other country which doesn't necessarily have a robust data protection privacy laws, right? EU has a GDPR, etc. So if open source LLMs, and we know for a fact that India's state-based, or I don't know, companies do not have great track record of protecting personal data like Aadhaar and even like recently COVID stuff from individuals or organizations. If open source LLMs can at scale collect, process, or store all of this and not comply, I mean, like an individual in a small cafe can access all of this. They don't need to comply. I mean, there is no way to make them comply with data protection and privacy laws, right? If they can use this data for users' online activities, browsing history, search queries, etc. I think, it's pretty evident that in India it's going to cause a lot of issues. Then what else? So the obvious advantages that are like creation of app, like making use of the coding abilities of an LLM that is fine-tuned for that to create applications for very specific needs and preferences of, let's say, linguistic and cultural groups, right? Like translation, education, even entertainment, let's say, But then again, this all assumes that the availability and quality of data is there. Compute resources are fairly affordable, I suppose. And again, we don't know how it's going to fit into the ethical and social values of Indian society, which is very diverse and not necessarily always progressive in the sense that it doesn't fit into the values of a liberal democracy, let's say. Then, the right to information is also part of it's been judicially held as part of like as a necessity for a dynamic democracy, right? But if this right to information or the right to be influenced also, is influenced by output from open source LLMs at scale, I don't know what's going to happen to democratic values if dilution of cultural expression or undermining the critical thinking abilities, misleading public opinion is going to happen. Is it going to foster or hinder social cohesion? Is it going to make sure that some communities or voices of people are either empowered or magnified or marginalized? We don't know. But in India, because of all this different microcosms of people exist, this is difficult to predict what's going to happen.
Right. So, especially because of this move, I think the pace at which all of these changes happen will be much faster. And like you said, there are advantages of AI. So it enables a lot of people to do a lot of things. But there are also a lot of harms that come with it. And it could. So this is a lot of change, and that needs to be understood better, especially in an Indian context. So there is a need to have these conversations to have a deeper understanding of how this impacts us. And yeah, so we need to pay close attention to what's going on and get a better understanding so that we can be able to better anticipate what's going on and maybe have a more responsible path for adoption, if that's if that can mitigate some of the harms. Right. So with that, I think we can wrap it up. And thank you so much for listening. And thanks, Satya, for joining us. We'll see you again tomorrow with a new episode.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.